move directly on to our second speaker. Hopefully this will give us a little time to have more discussion. This is Dr. Fabio Rambelli. He's a professor of Japanese religions and cultural history and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at University of California, Santa Barbara, where he holds the International Shinto Foundation Endowed Chair in Shinto Studies. He is the author, among others, of Buddhist Materiality and The Sea and the Sacred in Japan. He is also a student and performer of the sho, a musical instrument that is unique to Gagaku. So, Dr. Rambelli, if you could please begin.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And first of all, good morning, everyone, and greetings from California. Here is still the night before, so we're still on your yesterday. It is such a pleasure for me to be able to participate in this conference, and I really regret that I'm not there, in Delhi with you. This conference gave me the opportunity to share with you all some of my currently ongoing research project, and I would like to thank the organizers for offering me this opportunity. So I would like to share my screen. Can I do it?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. Just a moment. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so this is my is a PowerPoint. I just have a few concepts that I would like to highlight and share with you, and hopefully we can have a a brief conversation about that. So Professor Green just a moment ago was talking about a concrete network of exchange between India and Japan, and in my paper I'm going to talk about something else. It will be a different example, a little more unpalpable, if you wish, but perhaps not less significant. We're talking about the imagination, the pre-modern Japanese imagination of the soundscape of India. And, we have to keep in mind that there was no direct contact between India and Japan until, well, pretty much at the time that, Professor Green was describing. But at the same time, for about 1,000 years, the Japanese had this very powerful and rich imagination about India, which they envisioned as the source of their own culture, which is a quite fascinating example. And the imagination about India by the pre-modern Japanese was was covering all kinds of cultural areas, including music, and in particular this particular genre of music, Gagaku, about which I'm going to talk about briefly today. Here there are a couple of masks. I chose them because these are the masks that are used in dance compositions that were supposedly originated in India, and they were brought to Japan in the 700s, so like 13 centuries ago, and they're still performed. They're still part of the repertoire of the genre. So I guess all of you are familiar with Gagaku, but just to make sure, this is the standard ensemble. This is a picture of the current ensemble at the Imperial Court in Tokyo, which is how can I put it, the most orthodox and legitimate form of Gagaku, because it is performed by musicians who are descendants of families who have been handed down the arts of these various instruments for about 12, 13 centuries in an uninterrupted line that continues until today. In fact, my own teacher, for example, is the 44th generation of a family that plays that particular instrument. He traces his family origin to the late 600s, just to give you an idea. So this is an example of Bugaku, the type of dances that are associated with particular kind of music, again from the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. This is an image from I believe it's the 12th century, in which you see pretty much the same instruments, the same shape and the same repertoire, basically, which hasn't changed in more than a year. And again, keeps being, is still being performed today by the same musicians. Now, as you can see, None of these instruments is in fact originally India. Perhaps, the drum here at the center, which is a double drum, which is similar to the mrigandan in mridangam in southern India, is a double drum. But all the other instruments come from the Middle East, from China, from Southeast Asia, and other parts of the Asian world. That was a very general outline of what Gagaku is. But I also I think I would like to provide a larger cultural context to better situate my talk, and that will be the cultural imagination or the geopolitical imagination of pre-modern Japan, especially in the Middle Ages, from the 11th until the 16th, 17th centuries, and then things begin to change. But Japan basically saw itself as part of a network of three large countries. So Japan itself, which Japanese texts normally call Honcho, which is this dynasty, literally, and that refers to Japan. Then there is Shintan, which is a transliteration of the Sanskrit Chinistan, literally. So they don't use the contemporary word Chugoku. They use this particular Buddhist terminology. And then there is Tenjiku, which is a transformation of the ancient pronunciation of Sindhu, which refers to India. And according to a lot of sources from this particular period of time in Japan, Tenjiku is really the origin of a lot of things that are happening or were happening at the time in Japan. Not only Buddhism, of course, and not only the cosmology and the ethical system and all that comes with Buddhism, the epistemology and so forth that comes with Buddhism, but also, and particularly for this particular purpose, a lot of arts and crafts, for example. You have a lot of professional guilds from medieval Japan that claim that their origin is in India. The tools that they use were invented in India. You have Shinto gods who claim to be reincarnations of Indian divinities. You have cultural heroes from Japan who are reincarnations of Indian kings, rulers, or saints, or important figures in the past. So this is not just a few Buddhist monks who are writing this. This is something that you find all over the place in a lot of different sources, mostly in medieval Japan. That's why I like to use this highly contested term, I understand, the concept of Indianization of medieval Japan. And contested because, again, in this case, it's not a group of people from India going into Japan and forcing, the adoption of Indian models or Indian representations. This is something that the Japanese freely did by themselves, and also as a way to bypass the overwhelming influence of China. And they saw India, like I said before a minute ago, India as really the source of a lot of things that were happening in Japan at the same time, including the Japanese language, which medieval Japanese saw as a transformation of Sanskrit. In fact, you all know that the order of the kana syllabi, the order of the vowels and the consonant, aka, sata, nahara, that is based on the order of the Sanskrit alphabet. And that was developed in the 11th, 12th centuries by Buddhist monks in Japan. So, as in many other cultural fields, music was also envisioned as an aspect, a transformation, Japanese transformation of an Indian phenomenon, and Gagaku is particularly representative of this. Now, Gagaku, I have a couple of caveats here to further clarify where I'm going. Gagaku is normally understood today as the ceremonial music of the Imperial Court of Japan, which is true because it has always been performed at the Imperial Court since the beginning. But at the same time, since the very beginning and until today, Gagaku is also the Buddhist ceremonial music of Japan. Since the very beginning, in the 6th century, Gagaku orchestras were housed at Buddhist temples. And the most important ones were Kofukuji in Nara and Shitennoji in Osaka. And so Gagaku is a Buddhist music genre in itself. It was used in Buddhist ceremonies, and that also induced, the Japanese to see a deep connection between that particular kind of music and India, as Buddhist ceremonial music par excellence. Another caveat is that, by the way, sorry, something that is important. Gagaku itself, the term itself, comes from China. It's a Chinese word that refers to the ceremonial music for Confucian rituals at the imperial court of China. That is the term that was used in Japan, but the Confucian music used in China was never imported into Japan. It was replaced by all kinds of other different musics, including Buddhist ceremonial music. And that is the repertoire as it is used today. The second caveat is that when we talk about the Indian influences in Gagaku, we have to think about ancient Indian music, so which is not the music of India today. And I will say a few more words in a moment about that. Another problem that we have, is what makes a music element Indian. When we talk about rhythms and scales, you can have the same scale pretty much in many different cultures. What makes that particular scale an Indian one or an Indian element in Gagaku? And ultimately, I think we also have the issue, what is, the ethics of comparison. Basically, why are we looking for Indian elements in this particular phenomenon, which ostensibly has no direct relations to India? And this is something that I'll go back in the conclusions. Now, the most common Indian elements in Gagaku are here. These four or five elements here. A recent paper by Inoue Takako, which was presented at one of the conferences organized there in India about these exchanges between India and Japan. Professor Inoue made this list, basically. So the fact that an Indian monk, Bodhisattva in Japanese, together with a musician from what is now central Vietnam, Buttetsu in Japanese, went to Japan in the mid-700s and brought a repertoire of compositions and dances, which is still performed today. So this is, kind of historical element. We have traces of so-called Gagaku performances. This is a genre of performing arts, very ancient, 600s, 700s, 800s, which later disappeared, but we still have the masks that were used in those performances. And some of these elements were incorporated into what is now Gagaku. And Gagaku is written with the terms, with characters that are used in Buddhist texts translated in Chinese to refer to music in Sanskrit. So there is a more or less direct connection there between the music performances that were held in India at Buddhist temples, and apparently this type of music moved across, the Silk Road, went into China and then into Japan. So this is another kind of tenuous but historical phenomenon. Then we have exotic musical instruments. All the instruments that are used in Gagaku, in the photograph that I showed before, are only used in that particular genre. No other genre of Japanese music uses the same instruments. But again, perhaps only the double drum, as I mentioned before, probably is of Indian origin. All the others come from Persia, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, China, and so forth. Other Indian elements that have been pointed out is the aspects of music theory, particular scales and rhythm, and I will say a few words about that in a moment in the next slide. Now, something that we have to keep in mind is that no matter what elements from India we find in Gagaku, Gagaku does not sound like Indian music at all. So again, so this is, I think, is an important problem to highlight, because then it complicates the issue. So today I would like to present a different look at possible Indian elements. So some of them have already been highlighted, but I would like to look at them in a different way. Others are kind of new. And like I said before, ancient Indian music is not contemporary Indian music. For many of us, especially here in the West, Indian music is Hindustani music, with the sitar and the tabla. And sitar is a new instrument, starts in the 1700s. And so this has nothing to do with the musical theory, musical elements that we'll be discussing about Gagaku, which are probably more closely related to the Carnatic music from the South, which seems to have preserved more elements from, Natya Shastra and classical theories about and practices about music. But again, I'm not an expert on that. So, scales and modes, different scholars, from Takakusu Junjiro in the early 20th century, Tanabe Hisao, the musicologist, and so forth, they pointed out, the fact that Buddhist texts translated into Chinese contain some the references to some ancient Indian scales. Now, to me, a big stumbling block here is that Gagaku scales are based on a Pythagorean tuning. So the scales of 7 notes and the octave is divided into 12 semitones without microtones. So it doesn't sound like Indian music. There is no reference to the theory of the Shruti, for example, in Gagaku. However, so this is where I see the connection, and I think it's interesting, is that the two fundamental scales of Gagaku, there are only 2 scales, they correspond to the 2 basic scales of ancient Indian music. Sadji, which corresponds to the Dorian mode, is a minor scale in the Western theory, and Madhyama, which corresponds to the Mixolydian mode, which is a major scale in the Western theory. So, if you think about it, China had 84 theoretical scales. The Japanese chose those 2 that correspond to the basic scales of ancient Indian music theory. That is quite interesting to me, it's intriguing. Also, the different scales used in Gagaku function as choshi, which are modes, and the ways in which modes are developed in Gagaku are kind of similar to what happens with rags, with the raga in India. They set the mood of a composition, they have specific melodic patterns, melodic centers, performance techniques, and so forth. However, the theory of raga was not transmitted to East Asia and to Japan. But again, maybe some elements were present somehow, were handed down orally. We don't know, but we can see certain connections. The use of choshi in Japan is different from what happens in traditional Chinese music, for example. Rhythm patterns also are kind of interesting because rhythm patterns in Gagaku are incredibly complicated. And in that, they resemble, the structure of the Indian Tal, because there are like very long sequences that are repeated throughout the composition with different patterns, within those long sequences, which is kind of unique, in fact, in Gagaku among all the genres of traditional Japanese music. And also the structure, which has been pointed out already by different authors, is similar to classical Indian compositions because they begin in a rubato tempo and then gradually, take shape, and then it becomes a steady tempo, and then it becomes fast. And then in the end, it kind of dissolves again. In this sense, this is a strong parallelism that does, no other connections with other Japanese types of music or other East Asian types of music. What is particularly relevant, please let me know when it's time for me to stop, but I'm almost there. I have a few more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Indian metaphysics of music, this is present in a number of texts that were translated into Chinese, and the Japanese treasured, and they built up entire, commentaries on those. So the pervasive cosmic sound, for example, medieval musicians of Gagaku point out to that. The unconditioned origin or the divine origin of sound, the fact that that was the music played by divine beings in paradisiacal realms. This is also something that was very important. And also the tantric Buddhist connections and the role of music in those liturgies were also very important for the development of Gagaku. Here I have a few diagrams, but I think, I can skip those. What is important is the presence of a lot of narratives about the Indian origin of aspects of Gagaku. So especially like the stories about the origin of compositions take place in India, very adventurous and complicated stories. They are mentioned by many texts written in the 12 and 1300s by Gagaku musicians. So let me get to the conclusions, and really thank you for your patience in bearing with me. So we see that, so what is important to highlight is that the musicians themselves, living in medieval Japan, were aware of the origin, Indian origin of Gagaku, whether it's true or not, but for them it was an important aspect of their art. And in that sense, it was very similar to what other professional categories were believing, like I said before, about the Indian origin of their arts and their practices and their crafts. So in that sense, Gagaku is a kind of microcosm of medieval Japanese society and the importance that they gave to India. Why did the Japanese give so much importance to India? One theory is that, there seems to be like a proximate other, which is China and Korea, and a more distant other. And a lot of people thought that the distant other was really more precious, more important, more powerful. And I guess that this is a model that applies to many other cultures, also for us in the contemporary world. That we look at the other, not just one uniform alterity, but like with a lot of nuances, closer others, more distant others, and we give different symbolic values to the diversity of others that we envision in our cosmologies, even today. And so the other thing is that, again, very little came from India in terms of music. And so the Japanese filled in the gaps by including what they thought were similar elements from Chinese culture. And that's why it's so complicated, because you find a mixture of elements in many aspects of pre-modern Japan. But the logic behind this mixture, perhaps, is that, again, whatever was not known about India was borrowed from China. But this is an interesting way to combine cultures and create new cultures in a very creative and original way, which is not exclusivistic. It doesn't shut off the doors to other cultures, but it incorporates them and expands them. So I will stop here, and I would like to thank you all for your attention and your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Rambelli, for a very interesting presentation. I think we could take one or two very quick questions. Please don't make them too complicated.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very interested in, I'm Takako Inoue.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. In this evening, I'm going to show about the raga system and Gagaku scale and theory also, what you have pointed out.
Okay. So it was not completely off.
And actually, I'm looking at that and Gagaku music from Indian side, not actually from Japanese side, actually. Even I am a Japanese. Yes, and that's why in my Indian side, I just want to find out that how it is connecting, and also that I know that very well about that, and all the Indian music has changed. Not at all Natya Shastra music nowadays, actually, not at all. No theory is available in Natya Shastra based on that, and so that but in the translation, and comments and interpretation of Natya Shastra is very difficult to even in today's Indians, I think. Yeah. And there is not available about the Natya Shastra theory is not cannot be connecting is not well in today's raga system also. But right. We can find some and now. And also about that and how it is very different is in the raga system is and based on that and solo performance. based on that solo performance in Hindustani and both Carnatic music. But in Natya Shastra music is orchestral music. So today there is no classical music in India. There is no orchestral music at all. And this is, so it was, I'm very sorry that disappeared. And if going to some temples, in some South Indian temples, Hindu temples, there is some few, we can find that some orchestral music. I want to connect in this, you see that, and I want to see the Gagaku as an Indian origin. Original music maybe we can find. But there is no Gagaku music in here at all. It is, I can agree. Totally agree. So, but then I expect you that then how you translate or how you interpret Japanese imagination of Gagaku music, textbook of Gagaku music. You mentioned about the 12th century to 15th century, there is a lot of books. They are always saying that this is from India, this is from India, this is the story of India. There is a lot of writing we can find how it is connecting that the Japanese religious feeling, religious imagination, and that Gagaku imagination of India. This is very important also, and I'm expecting you to deepen this point. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I mean, that is a very difficult topic. Do I have a couple of minutes or?
Okay. Be as concise as possible.
No, you're right. Yes. So the religious theory, so basically Gagaku for the Japanese is the music of the Buddhist Pure Lands. And from there, they went to India, and then from India, it went to Japan. So there is this very deep religious connection there. Another deep religious connection is in the Buddhist, esoteric Buddhist ideas about the universe. So the fundamental sound, the sound of the five elements and all that, they get distilled into the sound of Gagaku. So there is this deep cosmology of the music, which is deeply related to these, again, originally Indian ideas about this kind of integrated, harmonious universe. So this is very short way to put it, but there are these very different threads that both of them come from India, and the Japanese developed them in different ways, but also in a creative way by incorporating Chinese elements and local elements as well. To me, this is absolutely fascinating, you know.
AJ, you wanted to make a comment? One more, and then unfortunately, we're on a tight schedule.
Yeah.
Thank you. Professor, my name is Anupam Joshi. I'm a Hindustani classical Indian musician. I just wanted to ask that you mentioned about the contemporary Indian music form, the sitar and the tabla, which probably developed from the 12th to the 16th century. However, from the 4th century, the style of Drupad, which is the ancient Indian music, was already present. Is there any reason you see that the exchange of either the Drupad style of music or instruments or the contemporary style of music or instruments, this exchange between India and Japan stopped suddenly?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. The exchange between India and Japan, again, was never, so it was always mediated by Central Asia and China, and was motivated by Buddhism, basically. When Buddhism disappears, then this connection also disappears. And that is quite interesting also. In fact, pretty much everything we know about Indian Buddhism dates back to the 600s, 700s, 800s, and something from a little later. But so in Tibet, for example, they have a later wave, right? That never came to Japan. So that's why whatever elements from ancient India in music, you know, exist, it's really from that particular historical period. It's kind of frozen in time. And there was no other connection afterwards, or if there was, the musicians were not interested in it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Okay, please.
Thank you for giving me that time. Since you mentioned that there are these two kinds of, there's a lot of connection between the two, or there's an influence between the two. I wanted to ask, when you refer to Indian music, what are you referring to? Because Indian music is as diverse as, as it gets. I mean, you can place it right from, before, So then there are strains of music in oral traditions. Communities have many, many kinds of traditions, and then it evolves, or when it's as complex as, so where do you locate it? You said that it is more to do with Carnatic music than Hindustani music, but even so, there are earlier elements, more, ancient melodies that come. So where do you place it? And it could have been nice if you had made it a little bit more specific to what you're referring to when you talk about Indian quote unquote music.
Professor, you're right. I guess I must apologize, but like Professor Inoue just said, I'm really basing myself on medieval Japanese sources, so they really make no distinction about regional areas in India because they didn't know about that. They only refer to India in a very broad and very generic term. The Japanese had some awareness of regions of India, especially they say the north and the south. They even mention different pronunciations of Sanskrit terms, which I don't know how accurate that was, but that was how far as they went. In terms of music, they really talk about Tenjiku, or which is like the general broad name for what they envisioned as India. So this is as far as I can go. I mean, I'm really just trying to find out what they might have thought about India. I'm not making any particular statement myself. I'm not trying to reify, the Indian musical tradition in any way.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much again. We appreciate your participation, and